Welcome to History Bites, a 1-hour casual conversation where we chat with interesting people about museum matters and ideas, as well as happenings at Guelph museums. My name is Val Harrison, and I am Supervisor of Visitor Experiences at Guelph Museums. Today, I am in conversation with Julie Baird. Hey, Julie. Director of Newcastle Museum, New South Wales, Australia. We will be chatting about symbols of remembrance and special dates of commemoration in Australia and Canada, and more specifically, activities related to our sites, including connections between Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, the Poppy, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, and his famous poem, First World War poem, In Flanders Fields. And for our friends in Australia, McCrae was born right here in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and his birthplace is now a National Historic Site. Now, before we begin our conversation, Julie and I would like to focus everyone's thoughts within an awareness and acknowledgement of the land. Both of our museums share a strong commitment to do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. And Julie, I'm going to invite you to start and share your thoughts.
Thank you, Val. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the traditional lands of the Awabakal people, proud survivors of over 200 years of dispossession. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and thank them for their continuous care of this land that was never ceded by treaty. This has always been, and always will be, Aboriginal land. The particular area that I'm joining you from today is called Mullumbimba, and it's place of the sea ferns, and we're nestled right beside the mighty Coquin River, which is known by the word hunter by most people, and that is the boundary between the Awabakal Nation and the Worimi Nation, but it was never really a boundary. Newcastle has always been a meeting place of different people from all over this island coming together for work and play and love. And I want to especially acknowledge any First Nations people joining us here today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Julie. Very thoughtful and powerful message. Thank you. And as Julie did, I too would like to acknowledge that Guelph is located on the ancestral homeland of the Anishinaabe people, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. The place we now call Guelph is on land that is described in the Between the Lakes Purchase Number 3 Treaty 1792, an agreement between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the British Crown concerning over 3 million acres of land between Lake Huron, Ontario, and Erie. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. Guelph Museums commits to the Truth and Reconciliations Commission's call to action and to do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. Now, when we started History Bites series, we spent time in close conversation about the land, its history, and its people. We continue to grow our knowledge and our relationship with our treaty partners, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, and with many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people who call Guelph home. This information and all we do at the museum is underscored, and it underscores our commitment to each other and to the well-being of future generations. This is especially true this week as we mark both National Indigenous Veterans Day and Remembrance Day and work to commemorate and build upon our knowledge and understanding of the contributions and sacrifices made by Indigenous service members in Canada's military past and present. And I know, Julie, that Newcastle Museum acknowledges many Aboriginal soldiers from your area, and their stories are told in your permanent exhibitions. So we have so much to chat about today, but first I would like to provide a proper introduction to my friend Julie Baird, who has over 30 years of professional museum experience and experience in the museum sector. She began work in Canadian museums in 1990, returned to Australia and joined the National Motor Museum in South Australia in 1998. Since 2002, she has been at Newcastle Museum and was part of the small team who moved and redeveloped the museum, which reopened in its new site in 2011. Boy, we have some parallels, our museum and yours.
We do indeed.
Yeah.
We do indeed.
And you are now the director of Newcastle Museum. The intersection of innovation and accessibility has been a strong theme in her major contributions to the museum sector. Julie's experience in researching, interpreting, and working with community has also resulted in a number of successful and national award-winning exhibitions, including the redesign and redevelopment of the Newcastle Museum's social history galleries and 1x4, which is a pretty amazing exhibit focusing on individual artifacts but telling 4 different stories. Congratulations on your award too, Julie. That was pretty phenomenal.
Thank you.
Yeah. Her career focus has been to spread knowledge in history and museums in unusual and popularized forums, working with communities as broad as embroidery guilds and TV audiences to female prisoners and bike clubs.
Yes.
Bikey clubs?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bikies.
That is a bike club, so that's pretty interesting. So busy woman. Julie sits on the Art Form Assessment Board, Museums and History for Create New South Wales, has been a standard assessor for museums and galleries New South Wales, and is the current vice president of the Australian Museum and Art Galleries Association. Yes, you are.
Thank you.
Yeah. Welcome, and thanks so much for taking time to meet with me today. And getting
no worries.
In the morning.
Yes, it is. I am coming to you from the future, Val.
Yeah, excellent. And the future looks good, you were saying?
Yeah, look, it's bright outside. The future looks bright.
Excellent, thank you. So probably many people are wondering about the Guelph Newcastle connection, and perhaps even why Australia rather than Europe, or more specifically Belgium and France. So, Julie, you and I have a rather long history, and it would be great if you could explain a little bit more about your relationship with Guelph and maybe how we landed on the topic for today's History Bites. I'll turn it over to you.
And it's an interesting one. So, for me, when I began my interest and my first sort of volunteerism in museums and learning, it was at Guelph Museum. So my father was a veterinary medicine academic, so we moved to Guelph to have Dad work at the university there. And so I did my high school and I did my university in Guelph. So I thought, what am I going to do with a history degree? And so I started volunteering at Guelph Museums. And I discovered that this was my passion and calling and love at Guelph. So even after I returned to Australia, I had 2 children born in Guelph and a husband from Guelph. And I've worked all over the place since then. And I have now a second Guelph husband. That sounds a bit, terrible. But that connection, my family still live in Guelph. And so that connection between Guelph Museums, that idea of that local government funded museum that's designed to tell stories of a particular place. Funnily enough, I feel like I've gone full circle, and I am, in a organization now with Newcastle Museum where the foundation is to tell local stories as funded by a local government. But we also have a historic site, Fort Scratchley, associated with us as well, which is the only land-based site that fired back during World War II. We had Japanese subs come into the Newcastle harbour, and Fort Scratchley fired upon the submarines. So I've got a historic site based around military, site, just like McCrae House, and I've got local government funded stories of our city. So it's, what is old is new again.
Yeah. So it was really interesting because we've sort of kept in contact. I've always admired, like, you, when you're home in Guelph, I call it home. When you come to Guelph, you always made a point of coming and visiting our museum and seeing what we've been up to. And then there'd be stretches of time. But I was so excited when you called us and contacted us, and your team contacted us to have a partnership. And then in those conversations, we started talking about McCrae. And that's what I found really fascinating too, that we thought of new ways that we could join.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things I think we always learn from what we've done. So certainly Newcastle Museum has always looked at Guelph museums and what they do and what your work is very highly. So some things, like, we completely ripped off your teddy bear's picnic and we did exactly the same thing. Other things like the use of poppies. I when I was young was in Canada and I went to John McCrae School, and the concept of the poppies and in Flanders Fields was so significant that when we started looking at ways to commemorate, the poppy sprung to mind in a way that we hadn't expected to. So Guelph is, Guelph is always with me, and so it's great to be able to have those conversations with other countries and talk about how we do things, because we always think that the way we do things is the way everybody does things. And I think it's really significant for museums to make people aware that it's a big wide world out there and there's different ways of looking at things.
Yeah. Yeah, and that sort of leads to where I was going with our next topic of conversation, because many of us assume that because our countries have similar histories of colonialism and we participated in both First and Second World Wars under the British flag, that we would recognize similar commemorative dates for remembrance. And early in our conversations, I learned where in Canada, November 11th, which marks the last day of the end of the First World War in 1918, is recognized as our primary day of reflection. And in Australia, although November 11th is marked, it also recognizes April 25th. And that's a more important date of remembrance. And so I know we mentioned the Anzac Day right at the beginning, but can you explain, because I think a lot of people on our end don't know what Anzac Day is and what it represents?
So Anzac Day, which is April 25th, is predominantly celebrated in Australia and New Zealand, and that's what Anzac is. It's the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps. And so April 25th was the day that troops landed at the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. And so we were part of a force that was trying to capture the Dardanelles, and so the Allies could go and capture Constantinople. And so Anzac Day is a commemoration of a landing. It's also, strangely enough, probably one of the few days of remembrance internationally that commemorates a defeat. So Anzac Day is not about a glorious win. It's about the beginning of Australia and New Zealand really fighting as nations. We'd been involved in the Boer War. Australia only became a federation nation in 1901. So really World War I was the first time that we were fighting as a national force. But it wasn't our first battle in World War One. There, pretty much as soon as the war started in 1914, there was action against Germany in New Guinea, just north, in Papua New Guinea, just north of Australia. So for some reason, this Gallipoli campaign, which was the first major campaign, has become the day of commemoration. More Australians fought on the Western Front than in Gallipoli. Gallipoli was an 8-month campaign that was pretty much disaster after disaster. It involved, for the New Zealand forces, 1 in 4 of them died at Gallipoli. So it was a major defeat, and we ended up leaving Gallipoli without achieving what we wanted. But for some reason, that's the commemorative date, and I quite like that's so Australian to commemorate the loss. But when you talk to most Australians, what they say they are commemorating is perseverance, resilience, and sacrifice on behalf of Australians. And so it's become a major thing. It's a day off. We always have a statutory day off work on April 25th. And it's predominantly commemorated by 2 things. So we have a dawn service. So, at the break of dawn, Australians gather by war memorials. In Newcastle, we gather on the beach, and most of the sort of somber official commemorative things are on dawn service. They also do it in Turkey. There's a big dawn service in Turkey on Anzac Day, and Australians and Turkish people hold each other in very high regard over that battle. And then there's also a big march at the 11 a.m. hour as well. So it's a different, very different kind of day. Remembrance Day exists, and I'm finding that last night, certainly on the news, the Sydney Opera House was covered in poppies, and there was an awful lot of discussions about Remembrance Day as being a particular day to commemorate. So it's almost like we have two now.
So are you seeing that there's a change over to the 11th, or is there a balance of?
They're very different. So Anzac Day is always incredibly prominent because it's a public holiday, and it's almost becoming a lot more about the holiday than Remembrance Day, which seems much more somber. So Remembrance Day and the 11 a.m. seems a lot more reflective. It seems to talk a lot more in Australia about international conflicts throughout time. So, for us, this is our first Remembrance Day after troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so there was a lot of discussion around the passing of time and how we commemorate different things. Anzac Day has become a lot more of a national holiday, as it were, about Australianism, and it seems that kind of focus, in comparison to what Canadians do, it's very, very different. Do you want me to tell you what an Anzac Day can be like here?
It'd be interesting because I think in comparison to the way we have our remembrance recognition and who's involved, and I mean I can even share about what our day was like today, which was really interesting. You had mentioned Afghanistan. That was mentioned by the person that was leading the talk this morning at our Memorial Gardens at McCrae House, and saying that it's significant this year because of that we are starting to think of the more recent conflicts and involving everybody. But yes, I would like to hear a little bit more about how it's recognized at Anzac and how different that might be.
Well,
Even
look, Anzac Day, there are no licensing or gambling regulations. So you wake up at the crack of dawn and you go down to the beach or the war memorial or whatever, and then people pretty much start drinking, which I know is kind of classic what people think Australians are like. And then all shops have to be closed until 11 o'clock. The marches are a lot more rousing. So New Zealanders pretty much only celebrate the dawn service, and then it's a quiet day of reflection. Australians use it as a real opportunity to talk about in almost like an enthusiastic drunk nationalism. So everyone goes out to the pub. There's a particular coin game called Two Up that was really popularized by soldiers in the trenches, because when you're in the trenches and you're bored and you're waiting, there's not a lot to do. So it's a very simple game where you have two coins on a paddle, you throw them up in the air and you bet on whether it's heads and tails, two heads or two tails. So everywhere has two-up games. So every sort of pub, community hall, bowling club, everywhere has two-up. And it's seen as this celebration of Australianism and soldiers. Anzac Day at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon is just roaring drunk early 20-year-old men roaming around town. And I think it's really interesting because, like, when my grandfather's a World War II veteran, was a World War II veteran, he never commemorated Anzac Day. He never wanted to remember. For him, he hit it home and he tried to forget. He did not want to commemorate. Australian Anzac Day is a lot more celebratory than commemorative. And I think that there's a lot of people that are turned off by that. And then perhaps that's why that Remembrance Day piece, which is a lot more based around, you know, the loss that war brings on an international scale is coming up just because people want to separate themselves, and it's almost like Americans with like Memorial Day sales. You know, people will go, "Oh, terrific! I can go to the hardware shop. It's Anzac Day." And I think that kind of side of things, Anzac Day didn't start right away. So Anzac Day, there was commemorations the year after the 1 year anniversary of the landing at the beach, and that was pretty soon after. But really, it took time. So really, it starts doing sort of dawn service and that kind of commemorative side of things really in the 20s. And then it's not until really the 30s that you get into those marches and that really formal structured Anzac Day across the country where it's a holiday. And I think that it's interesting the further you get from the war. So that we have no surviving World War One veterans. We have very few surviving World War Two veterans. Now most of our returned servicemen's clubs are run by Vietnam veterans. A lot of Korean veterans are gone. So now it seems like the more we move away and the more we idealize war and the role that war played in our national identity, the less reflective Anzac Day becomes and the more of a big drunken day out.
Interesting. So I think I see it as that Anzac sets Australia and New Zealand apart from other countries. It's specific to what happened in that country, something that you can hold on to, whether it be in celebration or recognition, but that's what sets it apart.
Yeah, and I think, you know, they have Anzac commemorations in London as well to commemorate Australian and New Zealand forces, but it's
To
very small
Turkey.
and
Yeah.
it's very minor. You know, the Turkish acknowledge our troops. Uh,
Mhm.
we acknowledge the Turkish troops as well. So there was always a level of mutual respect, I think, that I find quite heartening. But backpackers, Australian backpackers, often head to the Gallipoli Peninsula as part of their tour of Europe to combine with Anzac Day, to the point that there are thousands and thousands of young Australians that go to Turkey every year in April in order to, it's almost like a bucket list tick off. I was at Gallipoli during Anzac Day. And I think, you know, I think for me, a lot of Anzac Day discussion tends to be around mateship, resilience, um, uh, sort of valor in the heart of danger. A lot of it is about pulling together. And it's funny because we perceive that as an Australian ideal. I think a lot of those ideals are actually Aboriginal cultural practices that early convict Australia picked up. And so while we perceive those as coming from a white colonial background, I actually think a lot of that kind of stuff, that self-depreciating humor, the idea of the collective and mates and team, it's so Aboriginal, but we don't see that sometimes, white Australians. We don't understand how much of an impact Aboriginal culture has had on us, and we perceive it as coming out of war.
Mm. As we have had to happen in Canada as well. The
Yeah,
things that we've learned and brought into our way of doing things have been adopted and adapted from other
yeah,
cultures. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, fascinating. So following along that, Anzac and the things that have come from that, I was really fascinated when we were talking about plants as symbolism. And of course, I just poppy, of course, with John McCrae writing the poem in Flanders Fields and being the inspiration to the wearing of poppies. And this year, it's the 100th anniversary of the poppy as a symbol of remembrance. It's all about the poppy is such an important part of what our remembrance services, our commemorations, the Legion uses that as a way of by selling these, raising funds for veterans and projects that they are taking on. And then when talking with you, there was another plant that is used as a symbol of remembrance, and that's the rosemary plant. And I always found that was like an aha of that idea again of we all do the same thing. Everyone wears a poppy. I'm wearing a number of different poppies. This is a beautiful one, Naomi Smith, an Indigenous artist from this area, and it's raised beadwork and inspired by the wearing of the poppy. This is a poppy that is a modern day poppy that I would wear. I did get from the Legion, and by contributing a bit of a donation too, of course. And then there was a special commemorative poppy that came out. I was going to borrow it from my friend to put on as well, but I thought we were wearing too many poppies today, and I noticed you're wearing your poppies.
I know.
First, I would like to ask you to get you to explain the rosemary plant and the significance. And then I also found it was really fascinating when we were talking about our because you have your poppy on, your bits of poppy. Explain a little bit about maybe it's not as much.
So Australians have always used rosemary as the commemorative plant. Most people know rosemary, the herb. It grows wild in Turkey, and it grows in abundance in Turkey. So our soldiers, even though the majority of them were fighting in the Western Front, in Ypres and all those kind of battles that Canadians were in, because of the importance of Gallipoli to us, we've used rosemary as a commemorative plant. So every time if you go to a park and there's an honor roll with soldiers, they always plant rosemary. So Australians always know when we're cooking a baked lamb, you just go down to the War Memorial and you get a few sprigs of rosemary. And I find that it's interesting that now all of a sudden poppies have started to come in. So Newcastle Museum wanted to do something for Anzac Day, our first Anzac Day in our new site 10 years ago. And we were thinking about all these different things. We're not an official commemorative site. We don't have an official honour roll or an official role to play in the way that other sections of the city do. So we decided to do an almost like a flash mob idea. We had some small crosses that the Returned Servicemen's League had made in the 50s, given to us as a donation. And so I said, well, why don't we do a field of poppies? Because of the connection with Guelph, poppies, and also poppies are so internationally symbolic, and they're also so bright and so eye-catching. If I did a field of rosemary, no one would notice on my lawn, right? Because it would just be green and green. So we made 800 felt poppies, and so overnight we made a war cemetery and a field of poppies. And that was pretty unusual when we did that 10 years ago. You didn't see poppies in Australia very much at all. And same with the phrase First Nations. That was not a commonly used phrase 10 years ago. So I would use it because of Canadian upbringing, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is a bit of a mouthful, and it also symbolised the nationhood of the First People. So I'd use that and did poppies, and everyone was like, whoa, like there's poppies everywhere. What this poppy thing? And then there's just been this weird growth in Australia of poppies. So people know what poppies are now. So I got my poppy earrings from the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. That is a museum and commemorative space for Australians. And then my poppy shirt, I bought it just because I found a shirt with poppies on it, but now all of a sudden, so Fort Scratchley, which is was built on the harbour of Newcastle to defend Australia, funnily enough, against the Russians in the Crimean War. Russians never came, but we've got this beautiful heritage site. So they started a community project where people made poppies. So they told people how to crochet and knit poppies. So people all over our area made little poppies, and now they're hillside. They cover the hillside on Remembrance Day in poppies. And then the Opera House with projections of poppies. So all of a sudden, and it's like we see on the news international people wearing a poppy on their suit. Like every politician has a poppy on at this time of year. And so I don't know whether it's the internationalism of Australia and so much popular culture, but all of a sudden people are starting to use poppies as commemoration, and it's almost becoming an older generation that uses rosemary. But still, when we put out our small grave markers on the lawn, there are still people who come and they leave a bunch of rosemary underneath to commemorate the dead.
We're finding a lot of different groups. It seems like community groups want to express themselves in different ways with poppies. And so you see that different styles of poppies, different creations of installations, art installations, beautiful pieces where poppies are being used in and throughout the communities in Ontario, across Canada, this morning at our remembrance. And what we do today is different because of COVID, but finding people at 11 o'clock, although we in our memorial gardens were not, we didn't offer any types of commemorative activities. We found that many people were coming, visiting the memorial, and just to be there, to reflect. And it's really interesting. It's just like that. It's groups of young people, university students,
Yes.
teachers with their with their young children, having them read the poem, all doing different things to commemorate and to remember and to show respect and pay respect. So it's really interesting seeing, even when in times where we can't all gather together in large groups, people are finding ways to express themselves.
It's been really challenging, COVID and commemoration in Australia. So, we've had 2 Anzac days now under COVID, and that probably has been one of the hardest things. Australians did the first Anzac Day during COVID. They RSL decided to do a thing where at dawn people would go to the end of their driveways for a minute's silence, and then so photos of this spread around, but certainly from the volunteers that run Fort Scratchley, that was heartbreaking for them, because it's such a part of their world, and it's such a part of their life. The dawn service, the schools doing commemorative theatre, the marches, all that kind of thing has been quite difficult. And certainly with Remembrance Day, we're at quite a high vaccination rate now in New South Wales. But marches didn't happen, and there were set numbers, and I think that it's made people have to learn how to reflect in different ways, rather than that rah, let's all get together in a really large group, to try and actually take a moment out of their time. And we certainly marked 11 a.m. at the museum with a minute's silence and that idea of reflection.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering, because of course, with November 11th, like the poppy and the poem in Flanders Fields, it's sort of synonymous, right? It's what we do. It's what we do here in Guelph, of course. Most young school children are aware of it, especially the school where you were at, Jo.
I was about to say, I can chant it out. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and so wondering, because it's part of what we do. The poem, John McCrae, but more the poem itself, and then how it's influenced the poppy, of course, back in the early 1900s and 1920s, when it was recognized as a symbol of remembrance. What's it like in Australia? Where do people know the poem? They're
Well,
getting aware of the poppy, but do they know the poem?
well, it's starting to, and I know that sounds pretty stupid in, I guess, what is it, 103, 100 and,
Mm.
you know,
Yeah, well past 100
but
years, yeah. Mhm.
but certainly for me, I can recite in Flanders Fields the Poppy's Blood. Like it's one of those things that if you've been in Guelph, you can do it. What I was excited about is we have a Legion Club, which is on the main Eat Street, sort of like it's like the equivalent of being on Wyndham Street or something. And the club was started particularly for veterans from Gallipoli campaign, and then after they started dying off, they allowed Rats of Tobruk from World War II, and now it's a much more open space. So they painted the front of the Gallipoli Legion Club in poppies. Poppies everywhere, covered in poppies. And I was walking down the street and was like, where did all this come from? And then I turned and there's a small electrical box on the sidewalk in front of them, and they painted in Flanders Fields the poem, and then surrounded with poppies. And I'm like, John McCrae, like they planted this. So, and then beautifully enough, the next one down, they painted with a quote from Ataturk, who was the leader of the Turkish forces that Australians and New Zealanders were fighting at Gallipoli. But I was so excited about John McCrae because it's one of those things that um, it's like you guys don't know the poems of Banjo Patterson. You might have seen the movie The Man from Snowy River, but you don't know that this is our national poet and part of our identity. So there's some stuff that you'll find some people know about John McCrae, but it's probably about as many Canadians who know about our poets.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. So I had that question because again, that's part of what Remembrance Day is about. And of course, with our museum, we have the birthplace of John McCrae, right, Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, right in Guelph, and people on days like Remembrance Day come to reflect. Some, it's very interesting, do the sort of pilgrimage of visiting into Belgium, seeing where John McCrae wrote the poem, where he was, uh, where he died, where his the hospital he worked from. They do that, and then they make full circle to them. I found that interesting when you were talking about the students who go to Gallipoli. As a
Yes.
pilgrimage, I find that there's something a little bit like that too. Interesting parallels again of
Yeah.
the way the countries do that. So,
And
yeah.
I think it's quite, like we have a thing up at the museum where we've got stuff about people from our area who died during war, and we have little bits of paper, pens, and we say, "Who do you remember?" And you'll be very pleased. There's poppies on the magnets that hold them up, and so we find we have never thrown out a slip, and so every year on Anzac Day, we've got a big sort of like almost French style poster poll, and we cover it in who everybody has said that they are remembering. And I find that little kids now are drawing poppies. So little kids will actually take the time to draw poppies, and lots of people with really in-depth memories. Some people in multiple languages, which is great, and then some. I love the kids that just can't like. So I there's ones like Let's We Forget. Like, and there was one Les We Forget, like we'd forgotten someone called Leslie. And so for me, that idea that um, one of the things that museums do, hopefully, is make people remember and reflect not just on war, but on all different elements of our past and present and future. And so that idea that perhaps it's almost like a remembrance muscle. So if we're using that remembrance muscle around the war, then hopefully we can use that remembrance muscle around a whole other different sides of things like role of women or role of sport or, colonialism or all sorts of things. And we as museums, we start that conversation and we get that muscle working. And so hopefully all the little kids that, remember their cat on the wall that died, or at least they're using a muscle and they're
Yeah.
learning to remember.
Chance to express, explore, feel comfortable in the museums they're visiting, and that they feel safe and secure to be able to share these types of things, right? Give them
Yeah.
the forum, right? That's what
Yeah.
they're going to grow up to be, amazing museum champions, right? We
I
hope.
hope so. I hope so.
Hey, Julie, you'd sent a number of photographs of the different types of activities that you've done around remembrance, and you touched on the lawn that you covered, but you've done some other things too, right?
Last year was really special for us. So um, we have a day called Nadoc Day, which is a sort of national First Nations day of celebration. And last year, because of COVID, the first time, Nadoc Day was pushed back because that's certainly one of Australia's big concerns is the low numbers of vaccination in First Nations, and the preciousness of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We get really worried about COVID. So they pushed NAIDOC week back, and for some reason they pushed it back, and it was in beginning of November. So for the first time ever, NAIDOC and Remembrance aligned, because normally NAIDOC's July, like it's just nowhere near it. So we took the opportunity to, for the first time, on the request of Aboriginal servicemen from our community, raise the Aboriginal flag over Fort Scratchley. And so now we have not only the Australian flag, but also the Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander flag fly above this site. It was such a beautiful, symbolic moment, and the girl who suggested it was 5, and she was a 5-year-old Aboriginal girl whose uncle's in the service, and she said, "Dad, why isn't the flag up here?" And so, it took some challenges to people's belief systems to go, yes, we're going to raise this, but it was really beautiful watching these 70-plus-year-old ex-servicemen and this 5-year-old Aboriginal girl raise the Aboriginal flag, and little things like that. It'll be interesting to see what we decide to do in the future. Some of those poppy fields, in comparison to us all out there stomping on our little poppies and getting it in, some of that beautiful artwork that came out of England with the Tower of London and the beautiful poppies spilling over in the fields, and it makes me wish I had that budget and that staff. But I think it's all about doing what you can, and just making sure that it's something that's in people's minds, and I do spread the Guelph John McCrae message whenever I can. So I let people know that there's a
Army
reason.
champion, Australian champion, right? Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll expect you to plant some rosemary in your garden. It might
Certainly, I've
not
got those
flourish.
nice. Perfect. Yeah.
Oh,
And
good.
share. Yeah. One of my favorite. One of my favorite. Hey, Julie, it's really neat that you're saying the same thing. It's that's one of my things that I love to see is our youth and the passion that they are showing to the remembrance and commemorating and making sure we do it the right way and recognizing. I think that's where that's sort of the legacies of and we were talking about that. Yes, we've lost our soldiers from the First World War and Second World War, Korean. We're slowly where all there are memories, although it's wonderful that now we can video people's stories, but the people are gone, like we're losing them, and that's how do we continue on with keeping those stories.
So do you do marches in Canada? Do you have official marches?
We were not able in Guelph. What usually occurs is that the veterans and cadets, there is a parade. It was not able, we couldn't do it this year because of COVID,
Yeah.
but that is part of it.
So Australians, you can march in respect of your ancestor. So Australians on Anzac Day can wear, like I could wear my grandfather's medals and march in the Anzac Day parade. And so those parades get quite big now, and there's a lot more Australians applying for replicas of their ancestors' medals and marching in Anzac Day. And I guess my only difference, like I think about my grandfather, sitting on the back porch with a beer and hiding on that day because of the pain that he'd gone through in World War II. And I think perhaps as we become more disconnected from that, and we glorify some of that older fighting, yet on the news we see contemporary wars. And so it's a weird mix of how and what we're remembering. I think that it's interesting as time goes on and more people put on the medals of their ancestors, that the actualities of World War One and Two and Korea, people perhaps don't know. They're commemorating ideals more. But at the same time on the news, when you turn on the news every night and you see, conflict around the world, I hope that we're commemorating that and working towards a future where we don't have to march for our sons and fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters. I think that it's interesting whether or not we idealize things like Anzac Day and make soldiers out to be almost superhuman. When I look at photos now, like I never understood when I was a kid why everyone would say, oh, those soldiers were so young, because they were ancient to me because they were 21. And now I look back and there's that maternal side that you see the youth and you see the massive changes, things like the Spanish influenza and in Australia we had a big rise in drug deaths after Vietnam. There's all these other sides of that fallout from wars that we don't think about, but I hope we do, and I hope it makes a difference with people thinking twice before they step down that path.
Mm-hmm. So true, so true. So Julie, we're coming closer to the end of our talk, and we've talked I think we've covered a lot of topics. Was there anything that we've really missed that we had thought about? I went off script a little bit with our talk because it was just going so nicely in the flow of our conversation. I think we've had the chance to.
And I think that's what this needs to be. I
Yeah.
think commemoration needs to be a conversation. It needs to be listening as much as speaking. And I think that when I look at Anzac Day and Remembrance Day and Memorial Day and all these kind of things, it falls flat if it's not a conversation, if it's not actually asking people what their experience was, or spreading that word, listening to elders, passing it on, and also listening to the views of younger people. And I think that really you and I, who could have a conversation underwater in concrete, Val. I think that kind of thing, that the fact of going, you do something different, and what does it mean to you? That's how it should be. It should be a loose conversation where people can say difficult and challenging things. Like when we commemorate Aboriginal soldiers in Newcastle Museum, it's hard because soldiers in World War One couldn't say they were Aboriginal. So, a lot of stuff has come down through oral tradition, and war records just say dark eyes, dark complexion, dark hair. And so, you have to find out from the families some of those stories of Aboriginal soldiers, because they hid their Aboriginality in order to serve. And I think now
Fighting
it's,
for a nation, fighting for democracy, feeling like you're nation to nation. We were mentioning Canada and First Nations. understanding and believing that you were fighting for democracy, and then coming home and being forgotten about, your contributions pushed to the side. And it feels like we need to do a lot better at capturing those stories and telling true stories.
And that's
For
what
sure,
museums are
sure.
for.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Start
and
the
always all of
conversation.
our stories. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And give other people a chance to speak. And I think that, you know, Guelph, I applaud your efforts for going down a path of the decolonisation of your space and how hard that is. And, you know, I think
And
it's
you as
probably much
well. As
easier
you as well.
from a local government museum perspective. You know, sometimes I want the big budgets to do the beautiful cascading waterfall of poppies over a castle. Otherwise, I look at some of those state and national institutions that have a burden of that we don't have. It makes them harder to move. So I think the nimble agility and the fact that we are so close to our communities and we listen means that we are more able to shake off some of the elements of past museum practice and move towards the future. So thank you for giving me an excuse to get my poppy earrings out today, Val, and
Yeah.
have a little bit of a think of in Flanders Fields. It's
It's
good.
heartening to hear similar thoughts the other side of the world on how we are going forward in how we think and move in our museums and in the museum field, and what we do with the community and how we share in the community and speak and share other people's voices and speak with
Yes.
other people's voices. So it's pretty great that way. And I was thinking, because we've been talking about Remembrance Day and in Flanders Fields, John McCrae, it would be nice if we will end off with, we're going to see if we can find a nice rendition of In Flanders Fields, because so that people
Oh,
can,
thank you.
because I know you know it and I know it, and we could probably recite it to everybody. But we'll add that at the end. How's that sound?
That sounds great because I know
Flanders
certainly
Fields.
City of Newcastle is going to share this as well. So hopefully we can spread the word about John McCrae on in the future on this side of the world as
I'll
well.
send a package of blame. Of special. These are special tasks, and we it holds a well. Poppies are part of McCrae House for sure. All right, so I'm going to say farewell until the next time we have a chance to chat. We have to plan our days accordingly because of the hour differences. But maybe I'll do morning and you do evening next time if we can.
Fantastic. Sounds good. And you know, I am planning on taking a trip back and going through the swabbing and the difficulties just so I can get back. So yeah, I look forward to seeing you in the future, and thank you with this brand new technology that we can still have conversations and hopefully spread some word back and forth.
The good thing that has come out of all this COVID craziness. Some good thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So you take care, Julie. Thanks so much. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your hugely busy schedule. You amazing person. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Val.
In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields.